Want to welcome everybody to the ConnectED for 2025 this summer. And we're looking forward to having our two guests today share with us on data science. We'll do some more formal introductions later. Today's basic agenda, I will just share real quickly. Okay, so basically we have an award we need to present. Emma will do the introductions. We will have a panel discussion while we enjoy the question and answers, and then have some time for question and answers. If some of them are clarification questions, Ryan is going to be watching and making sure that Chad and Emmanuel are aware of any follow-up questions that seem need to follow on the conversation, but we'll also have some time at the end. And for you to do that, would you put your questions in the chat window so that we can do it that way rather than trying to monitor raised hands and things like that during the panel discussion. At the end, we do have a survey that we would like for you to just give some response to. So we will go let Emma take it away.
Thanks, Brenda. Like Brenda mentioned, I'll be presenting the Jane Jackson Award for Notable Service. Dr. Jane Jackson left Scottsdale Community College in 1994 to join Dr. David Hestenes as the co-director of the Modeling Instruction Program at Arizona State University. In addition to the myriad administrative tasks she was responsible for, Jane sought to build relationships with and connections between the many constituencies within the modeling community. Jane continues to be a vital member of modeling instruction, fostering effective communication and building community, workshop scheduling support, grant applications, and much more. The AMTA is pleased to acknowledge Jane's decades of service to the modeling community with the Jane Jackson Award for Notable Service to Modeling Instruction. This award is given to an individual who, through service in the area of modeling instruction, has elevated, expanded, and enhanced the modeling community. This year, the Jane Jackson Award for Notable Service is given to Dr. Chance Holworth. He's with us here today, so if you could take a few moments to type notes of congratulations in the chat, he'll be able to see them as I say a little more about his accomplishments. Dr. Chance Holworth heads the Center for Engineering, Science, and Mathematics Education, or SESAME, at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Chance is an avid creative promoter of quality STEM education and teacher professional development. He came across modeling instruction in 2008, and after attending a portion of a modeling physics workshop at Arizona State University, he became very excited about modeling instruction and brought it back to Sesame, with hopes of offering training to teachers in their region. Through Chance's efforts, an interdisciplinary modeling instruction workshop based on energy was piloted in 2009, which was a collaborative effort between Cal Poly and CSU Fresno. In 2013, Sesame offered their first modeling physics workshop under John Anderson, added chemistry in 2014, and in time, modeling biology was added to the Sesame Modeling Series workshops and was led by Frank Nowakowski. Chance's collaborators note that he is a wonderful person to work with, is committed to quality STEM teacher professional development, and is a creative problem solver. He worked with AMTA to keep workshops moving through the pandemic when the in-person workshops were canceled, and he has sought out and secured grants needed to continue hosting workshops in biology, chemistry, and physics. Thank you, Chance, for your dedication and tenacity in bringing modeling instruction to Cal Poly. Switching gears a little here, it's now my honor to introduce our two panelists for today's discussion on data science in the modeling classroom. So our panelists today are Chad Dorsey and Dr. Emmanuel Schanzer. Chad Dorsey is President and CEO of the Concord Consortium, a nonprofit organization dedicated to transforming STEM education through technology. His professional experience ranges across the fields of science, education, and technology, and he leads multiple NSF projects researching the use of educational technology for K-12 STEM education. Chad has been a consistent advocate for expanding K-12 data science education, organizing coalitions, convenings, and field building activities across the past decade, and co-founded the National Data Science Education K-12 Conference, which brings together over 250 researchers and practitioners to foster exchange and collaboration across the field of K-12 data science education. Our next panelist, Dr. Emmanuel Schanzer, is the executive director and founder of Bootstrap, which he first designed as a curriculum for his own students. He spent several years as a program manager and developer before becoming a public high school teacher and middle school academic coach in Boston. He is the founder of Computer Science Professional Development Week and has worked on standards, outreach, and advocacy for multiple organizations, including Data Science for Everyone, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and the Computer Science Teachers Association. He holds degrees in computer science and curriculum development and completed his doctoral studies at Harvard with a research focus on using programming to teach algebra. So how this will work is I'll ask our panelists a short list of questions that we've prepared, and I'll invite them each to respond to our questions as well as to each other in a panel discussion. We invite you, our participants, to answer questions as well, and we invite you to do that through our chat feature. Ryan Casey, one of our conference organizers, will be keeping an eye on the chat and will help us to field questions either during our discussion or afterward, depending on how urgent our question is with respect to our current discussion topic. So for my first question, and I'll start with Chad here, and then Emmanuel can respond too. My first question is, what exactly is data science, and what does it encompass as a discipline?
That's great. Thanks so much, Emma, and great to see everybody. But before I jump in, I just wanted to acknowledge how great this is as an opportunity and as a group. One of the things I didn't get onto my resume that Emma read was my background in modeling. So I started working as a modeling physics teacher in 2001 to somewhere around there. And I was part of the conversations with folks that started the AMTA way back when. So it's really exciting to see it come all the way along here. And I'm hoping, and if the group stays somewhat intimate here and the recording goes out to more, maybe there's a chance to open up, some conversation as we go on to a group because I think it'd be interesting to hear people's reflections on how the things that we're talking about intersect with your practice overall, which I think gets into this question of data science, because I think modeling has some great things to bring to the table with regard to thinking about data science education and plays a lot out for people in the general field of education in ways that can push things forward. And I think there are opportunities within modeling to think about expanding that work. So with all that said, you know, I don't, neither I nor I think anybody in the field has a great answer for what data science is. I think to some degree, one can say a little bit more about what it's not exactly. And I think we can start to hint a little bit at what the characteristics are. So let me just say some things and make a couple references to that. So I think it's not just collecting data or what have you. I think it's not just, it's certainly not just visualizing data. Um, and it is also not statistics per se either, although people on the statistics would often sort of argue around the corners of that. When you sort of look in general and search for what people's definitions are, you get lots of statements about data and knowledge. People talk about moving from data to information to sort of knowledge or wisdom. And you get lots of allusions to the fact that it's interdisciplinary. And I think those start to get at the essence of what has made people stretch for the term data science over the years. Those years might be 10, they might be 30, depending upon how you look at the history. I think the best, for me, still one of the best examples of how to get your arms around data science comes from things that Tim Erickson, who thinks in this world of data science education a lot, described at a conference about 12, 13 years ago, and in some blog posts. He talked about things smelling like data science was his phrase. Basically, how do you know when you're getting into data science territory? And his best framing was when you feel like you are awash in data, then you're probably in the neighborhood of data science. When you're in a place where data is sort of overwhelming in a way that you can't just apply a specific, paradigm or process or what have you, but instead you need to do things we might call data moves, where you're sorting or filtering or working your way through data, kind of machete hacking a path through to understand. That's when you're starting to get into the realm of what people have more traditionally called data science in my view and understanding. And I think as we've moved into this world where data is everywhere, where data are coming out in places in industry and in the world where the answers aren't clear and the questions even aren't obvious, then you start to get into this world where you're having to sort of apply methods that people call data science to start to grab onto to elements within it. And I think when you're there, you're getting into all of the layers people talk about. It's not just somebody with knowledge about data, it's knowledge about the disciplines that are involved, it's knowledge about tools and technology, it's knowledge about how to bring all those pieces together to start to answer a main question. But I'm interested in what Emmanuel has to say, actually. So let me shut up.
Sure. Well, so first I'll follow Chad's model here and add something that didn't make it to my intro, which is that my exposure to modeling first came when our organization partnered with AAPT and AMTA to build a physics curriculum that was, modeled on physics first. It was all about modeling, modeling instruction, and that I really can't emphasize how big of a shift that was for our team at Bootstrap. So some of you here may know this physics stuff really well that we partnered on, but what you probably don't know is that elements of modeling have been slowly leaking into every other thing that we do, which has been incredibly cool. And I think our our long-term running goal, right? We're never going to get there, but it's the distant future where we have $1 billion and we can make the curriculum that we've always wanted for all of K-12. That ultimate goal has shifted more and more to become a modeling curriculum. And internally, we talk about it that way. So I do want to just say how much I appreciate the incredible work this community has been doing for way longer than we've ever been around, because it's made a pretty big impact on how we see things. So it's awesome to be here. It's awesome to share the virtual stage here with Chad. I always learn a lot from everything Chad says. I'll do my best to give a definition of data science. I think Chad's exactly right that in some ways it's easier to talk about the things that it's not, but I will do my best to talk about the things that it is. So I like to cook, and if any of you like to cook as well, you know that you might start off following the recipe meticulously, but once you get comfortable, you realize that there's things that can change. And so I think of this as sort of a cupcake baking metaphor. So it might be that Emma over here likes cream cheese frosting on her cupcakes, and Chad does more of a buttercream, and then maybe I'm a psychopath and I put coconut shreds on my frosting instead. But we can all sort of agree that while there's room for adjustment, that there are certain core ingredients that you can't leave out, right? A cupcake without frosting at all is still delicious, right? But that's really just a muffin. And so when I think about what data science is, I think what are the 4 key ingredients that any approach to data science needs to have. And I think the prevailing national discussion really just focuses on 2 of them, which is your math stats, right? It's got to have rigorous math and rigorous statistics. Otherwise, you're just getting kids who are making histograms full of zip codes, and they're pretty, but they don't mean anything. And so that goes without question. That's a key ingredient. The other key ingredient that I hear talked about a lot is computing. And I think that's genuine, right? I mean, I think one of the things that's unique about data science that makes it different from the data analysis that you might find in an AP stats class is scale. So, Chad, you mentioned feeling like you're awash in data, and I think that's exactly right, right? So data science is where you're dealing with so many data points that you couldn't possibly check your work using a pencil and paper, right? It's so big that now you need computation to work over it. And that computation introduces its own affordances and constraints, right? How do you trust the calculations of a computer when you could never validate them independently yourself. So I think that's another important part. And so often we hear this back and forth about, well, how much computing is necessary, how much math is necessary. But I think they gloss over the fact that these two ingredients don't actually mix all that naturally, right? For any of you on this call who've done a bunch of programming, I think you know that the old adage, like, oh, math and computing, they're the same thing, is like totally nonsense. So there's some work that's often taken for granted about how to mix these ingredients. But even if that's done, I think there are two more ingredients to data science that are left out of the conversation, much to our detriment. So one, I would say, I call civic responsibility, right? So if we think of this as a math class, then it's great to identify a statistical question. But if you're doing data science, you want to cover the impact of who do we choose to ask this question? How do we phrase it? How are we asking them? Right? A math teacher can talk about the problems of biased sampling, but they can't necessarily talk about the problem of a random sample taken from a society filled with bias. And so a responsible data science class needs to look beyond just like the statistics side of things and talk about, well, if we're going to aggregate data to predict human behavior, which humans are we gathering this data on? How is it going to be used? And is it even ethical to do that, to gather it in the first place? And I think we all sort of understand that if you teach medical science without this ingredient, you get the Tuskegee experiments, and those were bad. Teaching data science without it gets you racially biased algorithms, weaponized social media feeds, thermonuclear grade redistricting, and gerrymandering. And that's just the start. So I think the civic responsibility ingredient is huge. And then the second ingredient that's left out is domain knowledge. And I think this is something that resonates really deeply for the budding modeler in me, right? If you're just thinking of data science as looking at scatter plots and like talking about the shape of the relationship, great. You could do that on scatter plots that deal with anything. Yachts, the finest vineyards in Tuscany, television shows from the 1950s, doesn't matter, right? But if you recognize the importance of students being able to bring their lived experience to bear in the classroom, right? For a kid who may not be a math or programming or science pro, but can raise their hand and say, oh, that weird data point, I know what that is because this data set happens to be about Pokemon or it happens to be about baseball, and I know something about that. And so, bringing in the domain knowledge of students that are in the room is critical to data science. And I think these two ingredients are the difference between data science just being this highly abstract, yet another cut at dry, mathy things versus something that feels visceral, concrete, and applied.
Great. Thank you both. And then speaking to our role as educators, how does a teacher's thinking about data science need to evolve? And Emmanuel, do you want to take a first crack at that one, and then we'll pass it to Chad?
Sure. I think this one I can answer pretty quickly. I think often teachers think about any promising new ed reform or new trend or fashion in education as yet one more thing that we have to find room for. And that doesn't mean we don't like it, right? A lot of us we've read Lil Jadal's book and we're like, oh, thinking classrooms, I got to do that. But then the way we go about it is we start to think, okay, how can I find 10 minutes to have kids up doing wall work, right? How can I do group work in this way? And it's super frustrating because now we're just cramming more stuff into the hole. And so I would say the way that teachers thinking about data science really needs to evolve, if I could just pick one thing, is to identify the myriad of ways in which the great work you already do has footing in data science. More often than not, when I meet great science teachers, especially modeling teachers, it turns out they're like 90% of the way there. And adding a relatively small additional sort of context, right? A couple of extra questions that you're asking to thread things together and get kids thinking one step farther actually gets you the whole ballgame. So I think the evolution needs to be, this is not yet another thing I have to make room for. The evolution needs to be, how close am I already? Because I'm probably really damn close.
Yeah, I think that's great, Emmanuel. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in preparation for this, and actually over a number of years, is thinking about data science and science/modeling instruction sort of in the same sentence. And I think I think what you're describing is exactly right, that, there's a ton of overlap and also a really interesting layer or sort of edge of opportunity there. And, so I guess I'd say from the sort of modeling teacher's perspective, I think the evolving is zooming out, 15%, not, we're rethinking massively or what have you, but thinking just a little bit more broadly about the experiences. At least, speaking from my own experience as a modeling teacher, it's easy. I mean, modeling is transformative, and it really changes the way, teachers and students think about approaching, their discipline, science, in my experience in particular. And it's also a process, and processes can be, sort of laid out and sort of unified, and can get into even a bit of a rut. And I know I felt like that myself. And it's easy. I found it easy in modeling, and recognized only later too that I was sort of doing data, but not always thinking about the context in which I was doing data and the experiences that I was giving students. And I'd say for me that zooming out feels as if it's saying, okay, how are we giving students, ourselves, curriculum, the opportunity to see the sort of world and set of larger skills and experiences in which this doing data sits in some way, shape, or form. And I think you're right. It might be adding a couple questions. It might be adding one new activity in the year in some way that helps you put a thread through all of the skills and experiences that you've been having the last 3 months. And we can talk more about, some of the layers of things that often get missed there. I think the exciting thing is that modeling has a chance to open up students thinking toward data and data science, I think often much better than many other approaches and subjects. And I think it could help the field in lots of ways because it's so close to the metal in terms of working with data and brings so many of the skills to bear that I think that there's a lot of huge opportunity.
Great. And jumping off of that, which teachers should be involved in teaching data science? And I'll toss that to either of you who is drawn
I
to that.
mean, my guess is we'll both say everyone. What's the next sentence within that? I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I think the interesting question from my side is everyone, but which ones in which way? And I think we're all trying to figure that out to some degree. And part of the interesting question for me is, scratching my head about, okay, what are the things that modeling teaching has to bring to the table toward this, and where are those? In some cases, yeah, that might not be data science, but it's, it's the pieces of that. Like if you're cooking, you need knife skills, to use Emmanuel's metaphor. You need this something, you know how to use a measuring spoon. That takes learning. So all those pieces are, necessary and maybe not sufficient.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The answer is everyone. And linking back to the two missing ingredients that I mentioned about the domain knowledge and then also civic responsibility, I think it's clear that like math and science teachers, while they have time to touch on those issues, not all of us have time to go deep. And that's okay, right? I mean, this is why we want the social studies teachers involved. This is why we want the ELA teachers involved, so that we can all, chew on different parts of this problem. I think it's unfortunate that for virtually every STEM reform, let alone those coming out of Silicon that are backed by Silicon Valley, the way data science is, it seems like disrespecting the expertise of our humanities colleagues is like standard procedure, which is insane. And I do think that data science will fail if we don't reach out to the folks who can join us on this, right? So as an earth science teacher, maybe the best I can do as far as civic responsibility is have my kids look at some data on, let's say, climate, and then we do our whole thing, we do what we usually do, and all I can do to address that last ingredient is say, hey kids, did I forget to tell you that this data set came from Greenpeace? Oh, or was it ExxonMobil? I forget which. And then give the kids space to talk about what that means, and what it means that perhaps I didn't disclose that in the beginning. Maybe that's the only time I have for that in my science class. But that's why I want my social studies teacher to back me up. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and we've seen, lots of interest from areas that you might be surprised. English teachers, have been very interested in some of the data science programs and projects that have been involved in. Social studies teachers and history teachers get it instantly. So I think there's lots of chance across the curriculum and the school. And that opens up, discussions with common, methods and ideas and tools and what have you in ways that might not happen otherwise.
Great. And getting a little deeper, how can we make our students' experiences with data more authentic to real data science practices in both math and science classrooms?
So I'm seeing some of the questions in the chat. We're thinking about the things that we're talking about here, and I think there are lots of opportunities. So I'll riff a little bit on some of those, and interested in hearing what Emmanuel thinks and others in the chat maybe as well. Um, so one of the questions, and I think this is not a solved question at all, as I was saying before, is sort of how do you expand the world of data that students are working within. And one of the directions to do that in is larger data sets. What do we mean by larger? Well, I mean, one thing we might mean by larger is more data points, and that's definitely true. The thing that people often don't think about and is easy to miss in a modeling classroom is wider data sets, more variables or more attributes. A lot of the really interesting explorations come when you don't have a t-table with 2 attributes, but you've got a CSV file with 18 attributes in some way, shape, or form. And the question might be, what patterns can we find, and why? Some disciplines, this is easier than others, and coming from a physics background, like sort of mind exploding to try to think about more than a couple variables sometimes, but not entirely. And modeling teachers can do that. In other places, somebody mentioned biology in the chat, there may be cases where this, lends itself much more naturally because there are, external data sets that have many different variables, environmental or otherwise, that make it easier to sort of, bring people to the table and say, what might we find here? The other kinds of things that come with bigger are equally interesting, I would say, and bigger in various ways. So just highlighting a couple, Emmanuel is alluding to this notion, but being really explicit about it is important. Data are created by humans for human purposes, always. And the closer we get to the science side of things, the more we try to forget that, but it still remains important all the time. In environmental sociological places, that sort of notion that somebody is creating data for human purposes often is more apparent or comes with agenda kinds of questions. On the other side, somebody chose to do that for a certain purpose. That comes out as you're preparing for a whiteboard session and trying to get a sense of what do I pull out for students? Well, like, why did you make the choice to align the experiment in that way? Might be important to dwell on for a few more minutes, and it might really tease some things out. And sort of that could be an experience that helps students recognize that, oh, anytime somebody's making a measurement, they have made some choice about it, but they've done it with some intent. And what was their intent and why? A couple other layers that often get brushed under the rug in science class. Um, Variability is sort of the reason that we work with data in the first place. And in statistics class, variability is sort of king often. Things aren't, even worth talking about if they don't vary. In many science classes, certainly speaking as a physics teacher, it's the thing that is annoying and just sort of gets in the way of the real answers. But in reality, it's where the real science and the real data science live in many, many ways. We've done a lot of work in the last, 5, 10 years, helping think about when you're doing inquiry science, where the learning and the opportunities happen, and trying to lift up in many cases that lots of the opportunities happen in the messing around stage that we feel like is wasting time. But really what it is working with equipment in many different ways to understand what you can and can't, get out of it, colliding with the real world in those ways. That's a huge part around of data science, to try to understand where that signal exists. We often, how many data points should I take? We can all go, like 3 is the answer, 5 is the answer. Well, the answer is enough to figure out what data means. And maybe the answer is for lab 3, you take a half hour and everybody takes 20, or 30, and you try to understand, like, what does it mean? Like, why might we choose 2 or 3? What does it look like to plot a data point? That sort of sense of variability as a way to understand the nature of data. Those are just 2 examples of things that you might be able to pull out to bring a little more relief to this layer of data science that exists underneath the surface.
Emma, I hope it's okay if the answer I give here sort of steals thunder from some of what we're going to talk about later. There's a later question that I think we're going to get to about what would we recommend to teachers in math and science as they go into the classroom. And I think I'm realizing that a lot of what I want to say here is what I would have answered that question. So I hope that's okay. So I think, the way that we use data, especially data for modeling in data science, is directly in conflict with conventional math classes, right? Which typically introduce like a parent function. And then it's like, here's all the things about the parent function. Or even conventional science classes, which introduce like an explored phenomenon, right? So we're going to roll a bowling ball down a ramp, we're going to take measurements, and like, it's all about the phenomenon. Or it's a hypothetical. We're like, imagine a bowling ball. Data science basically, we flip that and we start with the data. And one way to do that, so this is my direct answer to the question, is either have a large, messy data set with plenty of variability, and have kids start by just observing, right? Noticing and wondering. What do we notice? Have them, do small groups, share amongst each other, then have the groups report back to the class, because no 2 groups are going to notice the exact same thing. As an alternative activity, let's say you don't have that data set. Tell kids, okay, we're going to roll a bowling ball down this ramp, but before we do anything, here's a scatter plot, right? A blank scatter plot with time and distance. Draw what you think the readings are going to be. And if there's variability, I want to see variability. And we're going to talk about why and have students share that as well. Starting with this, before you get to the parent function in a math class or the experimental phenomena in a science class, gives you so many more hooks for kids to dive in, right? So for kids who aren't super math focused or science focused, this is incredibly low stress, low pressure. You literally can't get anything wrong. You're being asked, what do you notice about this data? Or make up some data and make it make sense. And so that brings in a lot of students. What's cool is that it also opens up, and this is why data science is so powerful, it may open up corners of a phenomenon that as a science teacher, I never even thought of. So a kid might have some cluster of points somewhere that I never even imagined. And I'm like, what the hell is going on with these points? And the kid says, oh, well, I thought, maybe the ramp that we're going to use, like at home, I know that like the wood kind of bends. Like if it's really a long ramp, it kind of bends. And I thought that would change the velocity or acceleration. And I would never have thought to talk about that as a science teacher. But now I can draw a circle around those points and be like, this is awesome. For now, let's assume it's a completely straight, wooden ramp or metal ramp. How would that change? But then I want to come back to those dots later to have a deeper discussion, right? So I think that kind of approach is really valuable. So in response to some of the stuff that's in the chat, so one teacher says, I've got students collecting data with a sensor, air quality, noise, water quality. Should I get them a mentor? Possibly, but you might be able to do it yourself before they go out and gather that data, right? Ask them to draw a sketch, right? How do you think this data is going to look? Because I bet air quality is going to vary with respect to temperature, right? And even if they don't already know that yet, you can just pose the question and have them have that discussion, because that's going to change where they go to sample their data. Suddenly they're going to say, oh, wait, we should probably sample data over time, right? Or we should probably not do it next to an exhaust fan, right, from some big building. So that discussion helps them gather better data. And then because they've all chimed in to hypothesize, now their egos are involved. So now they're much more engaged in analyzing the data to see who was right. And for the kids who weren't right, they're now motivated to say, well, that's probably because we sampled it this way. I bet if you did it this other way, that would matter. And so now that like you're getting more engagement, you're getting more juice out of the same activity. And then when they compare their data with kids from Colombia, if that data is not in agreement with their data, now they have all this great raw material to talk about why. None of which would have happened if we just said, let's start with the phenomenon and then analyze the results. And another teacher asked about how this might change biology education. I think you probably know what I'm going to say, right? Let's say we're doing plant growth, right? Before you start with the plant growth and measuring data, tell the kids, all right, we're going to put one plant near the sun, one plant far away, graph what you think the growth of these plants are going to be. And I think someone else already pointed out, if you have a lot of kids, you get a lot of graphs, which means you're going to have variability. And so you ask kids, put all the graphs together. What do you note? Well, we notice that the slope of one is different than the slope of the other. Even though all of our individual lines are different, there's clearly a trend we're predicting, right? So that's one example of a million you could do in biology and physics and earth science and so on. So now it's my turn to shut up, and I will.
Yeah, it's true. So I'm going to just riff off of that because I think that there are some interesting, often unrecognized opportunities that lean into data science that might be, quite possible in a modeling classroom. So playing off of the example Emmanuel was just describing, where you're looking at a bunch of different plants, or maybe it's a bunch of different ramps or what have you. One of the things that is important in data science, and it goes unrecognized until you sort of stumble on it, which for me didn't happen until long after the classroom, is that the structure of data is really important. And so what do I mean? Well, what I mean is the way in which you lay the data out in a table has to do with the nature of the data itself. Um, that almost doesn't make sense in many of the cases that we're used to in the classroom, because we have presumed so much to begin with that we don't ever give students the opportunity to stumble on it. But if you were to say, here are 30 plants, go measure them, or measure something about you would quickly stumble on the question of, are we organizing this plant one, plant two, plant three? Are we organizing these in columns? Or what's in a row? What's in a column? Are those columns things that are parts of larger groups? Do I have 12 experiments? And how do I lay those experiments out? Am I repeating something over and over again in the column? These all seem almost peripheral until you start to get to data sets that are so big that you need to analyze them with some kind of a tool or technology, or until you start to bring data sets together and realize that we can't talk about data in common unless we've structured it in common. So we often end up in modeling classrooms trying to put things forward where we get variation in ways that we can sort of layer together and then see that the differences between your ramp and my ramp. There could be opportunity to not have to spend so much energy thinking about those intricately layered sort of individual experiments that I set up for students, but to say, everybody go try, and then realize part of the opportunity in a certain case might be, how do we agree on structure of data? How do we think about the structure of the data sets themselves? So that sort of example is something that is very much at the heart of data science in general. And it also lends itself to lots of other really interesting layers. Transforming data is as important as understanding the data itself. So knowing how you might transform from your structure to my structure, or how you add a new variable so that my data can compare to yours, that's a sort of calculated variable in some way. How do we process the data, dealing with missing data, or dealing with data that are zeros or what have you. All those things are equally important, and at least speaking for myself, ones that we try to brush under the rug most of the time. Warts and all, it can be a really good thing when you're dealing with trying to think about data science.
Great. And thinking about concrete skills, which Chad was just alluding to a bit, what should an 8th grader versus a 12th grader know and be able to do with data? Like, what tools should they be able to use as they make sense of data?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll riff on that a little bit. We're still trying to figure this out as a field. We're, together with Data Science for Everyone, releasing, coming up in the next month or two, a pretty big framework around data science education. That's a draft framework for K-12. It's got a lot of stuff in it, so it's a lot to absorb, but it does have some sort of first best guesses about this notion of what might happen at different grade bands. And as one might expect, the answer is, getting more sophisticated overall. Lots of it's aspirational, which is to say, like many standards, or not, maybe this isn't standards, but it's sort of suggestive of that. Sort of what do we hope that eighth graders or 12th graders could do is an assumption. In the past, some other statistics, guidelines in this direction have gone dispensed with grade levels entirely, and said, stage A, stage B, stage C, because we do so little with data in so many subject areas that it doesn't really matter. If you haven't done anything with data until ninth grade, then you're in stage A regardless. But I think getting more sophisticated all across many of these sort of dimensions that Emmanuel and I are describing is the key. Dealing with a decent chunk of data where you've got to think about multiple attributes. You should already be doing that in early middle school in lots of ways, trying to understand sort of how you can wrangle that and make meaning of it. Probably you may not be doing that as much in middle school as in high school. Dealing with understanding that there's variability, definitely that's something you should be doing from first grade onward. Understanding the nature of that variability and where it comes from is something that might lend itself much better to sort of early high school and onward than than in sixth grade, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy to get sucked into discussions about tools. So Chad did a phenomenal job skirting around that, and I'm going to try to do the same thing because I think that we often get way too caught up in tool choice. So I'll focus more on the first part of the question as Chad did. To me, um, I think Chad's exactly right. Elementary school is the age where I want students to be able to think about multifaceted data, right? That like there's always multiple columns, and there's always columns that are invisible to us because they just weren't collected. And so what does that mean? What might that mean? So to me, that's like tabular data is totally an elementary subject. Eighth grade is what, terminal middle school. So what, given if we assume that kids are coming in with that, which, is not a great assumption, but let's just say that that's where that goes. Now in middle school, what do we want kids to learn? I want I want middle schoolers to learn all of the data visualization needed, right? And this is already in the math standards. So your pie charts, your bar charts, your scatter plots, your histograms, right? That's already in the standards. And so if we can do that with real data and actually have meaningful conversations with students about what story this chart tells, I think it's really valuable. And just because I know, we're trying to get our heads around how is data science different from, let's say, math, I just want to give you one concrete example. A math teacher will say, my job is to teach a sixth grader pie charts and bar charts. And they are absolutely right about that. So how is data science different from that? I would want an eighth grader who's taken some data science to be able to understand why, let's say we're doing a poll of, people's religions in New York City. A pie chart can hide a biased sample in a way that a bar chart can't, right? Let's say I do a biased sample in New York City and I have no Jews in my sample at all. My pie chart, there's no such thing as a zero slice. It's just missing. Whereas a bar chart will have an empty space. And so to me, that's what I mean when I say an eighth grader needs to be able to hit the data visualization stuff. Not just that they know the math side, but that they understand how civic responsibility, in this case manipulation, plays a role. I would want them to understand the basics of modeling algebraic relationships in data, right? Every eighth grade math teacher does line of best fit. Guess what? That is a linear model for data in a scatter plot. So I think that's my eighth grade shtick in terms of the learning outcomes. And as far as what that means for tools, I think there's a lot of latitude, right? I don't think that like learning to program is a requirement for an eighth grader. I think there's some phenomenal tools. I'll give a shout out to CodeApp. I think it's like the best data science tool I've ever seen, which Chad's group is in large part responsible for. But ultimately, yeah, you need some kind of tool that embodies tabular data. and there's many options out there. And I'm happy to answer questions about this later. I'll just point out spreadsheets are not that tool. Like they don't have tables, they have grids. And anyone who's tried teaching data science with spreadsheets has quickly found out how frustrating that is. What should a 12th grader know? So I think given that in America, high school math is often way too focused on the F word, and by that, of course, I mean functions, I think that students need to have a solid understanding of nonlinear models in data. So, every physics teacher knows how important parabolas are. Every bio or science teacher knows how important exponential and logarithmic growth are. I think I want a 12th grader to be able to look at, let's say, a scatter plot and start to model it. Not picking a log model because this is the month we're doing the log unit, and therefore everything must be a log, but because they can identify facets, the shape of that relationship, and link that to something that they've seen. And that also means they need to be able to put that in context. So if it's a log model, what does this actually mean as I'm trying to explain this to somebody else? What do outliers mean if they're above or below the curve or the parabola or whatever? And the second thing I would add to what I want high school modelers to know, 12th graders, I deeply want them to have some form of understanding that data science and data manipulation is function composition, right? So I have a table of like animals at a shelter and I want to filter them. Well, I'll just put it in the chat. Like, here's an example. And then if I want to make a pie chart of those dogs that I filtered, and I want that to be, I want to look at whether they're fixed or not. Well, Zoom isn't letting me copy paste. I would say take that and then wrap a function around it, which says make a pie chart. And so filtering, transforming, all of these are composition of basic functions, which also allow us to talk about groups, right? Because the moment I'm filtering, suddenly I'm looking at groups and subgroups. And while I wouldn't necessarily expect an 8th grader to look at a data set and look at a histogram and say, that's funny, I noticed all the rabbits are on this side and all the dogs are on that side, I would expect a 12th grader to, and to understand why sometimes disaggregating data is more important than aggregating it. And so as far as what tool I would recommend there, simply because I think functions as a modeling tool and function composition as the language of data science is so important, I would expect 12th graders to have some exposure, whether it's literally in math class doing function notation or using some form of simple programming to do this. I think that's an important element.
Yeah, so let me follow on to that with a couple things that I think everybody ought to be able to do at different levels of sophistication and maybe an opportunity or two. So I think that what the manual is saying is exactly right about students being able to use tools, and I would say that the yes and piece to that for me is students should leave school, your class,